Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you're listening, this is Lawton Online, exclusively on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton, and we have a great podcast up ahead for you. Today, we're going to be discussing later on the ongoing protest in my province, the province of Ontario, when it comes to the sex ed curriculum, and lots more fun stuff coming up. But I wanted to begin and spend some time talking about what I think is one of the biggest stories of the week, probably of the year. And it's when free speech and violence are at odds with each other. It happened in Garland, Texas. You're aware of it by now if you've even given a passing glance to the news. An event hosted by Pamela Geller in a suburb of Dallas was home to the Draw Muhammad contest. Obviously, an event intended to provoke, perhaps inflame, but that's, I think, within anyone's right as someone who embraces free speech. And we actually had one of our own, David the Menzoid Menzies, a Rebel contributor on the ground, and he joins me now to talk about what the event happened, what happened at the event, but more importantly, what went wrong. Menzoid, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome to Lawton Online.
Andrew, great to be with you, my friend.
So let's start first off of what the heck were you doing there?
Well, I was there, Andrew, because there was indeed this Draw Muhammad contest that received illustrations from artists all over the world, brave individuals, I might say, in stark contrast to most of the mainstream media that wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole, i.e. reproducing a cartoon that ended in the slaughter of innocents in their own business. I'm talking about, of course, the Charlie Hebdo massacre in January. And by the way, Andrew, just to give you a little background, why Garland, Texas? Well, here's why. Back in January, CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, at the Curtis Caldwell Center in Garland, Texas, held in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo massacre a Stand with the Prophet event in which they had some pretty odious individuals on the panel. And let's not forget, CARE gets a lot of its funding from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is considered a terrorist organization in certain countries. So what happened there was about 2,000 people came out and protested this. Interestingly, Andrew, even with that many people out there protesting, nobody got hurt. Nobody threw a bottle. Nobody got injured. There was no death threats, but peaceful protest. Well, that got Pamela Geller of the American Defense Freedom Institute to organize at the same venue this Draw Muhammad contest and a conference that featured speakers not only with Pamela Geller but Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch, and Geert Wilders was there.
Geert obviously being internationally renowned for his work. He's a Dutch lawmaker.
That's right. With a considerable bounties on his head,
yeah.
And this is somebody who has been tried unsuccessfully for hate speech in Europe. And as well, the artist, the winning artist, was there, Bosch Foston. Very interesting, Andrew. He himself used to be a Muslim, and he won the grand prize of $10,000 US. And the People's Choice Prize of $2,500 US, and it was for a very simple yet nuanced cartoon. Basically, it's a very feral or Wolverine-looking Muhammad brandishing a broadsword, screaming in a voice bubble, "You can't draw me," and then off the page, the artist's voice is in a voice bubble, and it says, "That's why I draw you." And basically, what's been very interesting is the media coverage and the response from the apologists out there.
I want to get to that in a second, though, David. I'm curious, how was the winner of the contest actually selected?
There was of all the entries received, it came down to I think a top 10, And then the panel judged it, and he went through. And then there was some online way you could vote for the People's Choice Award, and Bosch won that as well.
So talk to me about when the event went off the rails in terms of how it was anticipated to go.
Well, what was very interesting, Andrew, is I went to the Curtis Caldwell Center hours before because I was anticipating maybe there would be a counter-protest to this. The event began at 5 o'clock Texas time, and I got there around 2:30. And the first thing you noticed was the enormous police presence. The Garland Police Department had cruisers at every entrance and exit point to the center, and everybody was being checked for, their name, their ID, before they could enter and park their car several football fields away from the actual conference center. So from there you walked, maybe, 600, 700 meters, and then you went through, it was a temporary setup of this airport security to get into the conference center. So, and also there was SWAT team and, combat ready police officers there, Andrew, and they had mobile observation posts. These are these things that are like up on tripods that go 3 stories.
Yeah, we're talking the G20 meets Garland, Texas here.
This was Garland, Texas's G20 moment, absolutely. And you're thinking at first, given that not one single protester showed up, this is kind of like employing an atomic weapon to kill a fly, right? But what happened then is the conference kicked off at 5. It ended at 7. And when it ended, most of the people were still in the conference center because they wanted to purchase books, they wanted to speak to the artists, speak to the guest speakers. But a few, were ready to go home, and they started trickling out. And that's when all heck broke loose. Suddenly, people were running back in. Police were barking at them, get in, shut the doors. They shut the doors. And that's when news came of the fact that these 2 individuals had shown up with automatic weapons and body armor.
Wow.
And
did you hear any of the gunshots from inside?
No, this is the thing. We were inside the conference center, and like I said, it was several football fields away, and there was a lot of noise in the conference center of just people chatting, and so no, I did not hear or see the actual act of terrorism. I suspect what these fellows had in mind, given the timing, was that they were either going to come there and pick people off as they exited, or they were going to storm the conference center and commit mass murder. And if there was no security, Andrew, let's put it this way: I'm not talking to you today. Okay?
Wow.
And so, but what is kind of inexplicable is that when you look at terrorism by the likes of these extremists, they typically go for the soft target. I mean, if you look at Charlie Hebdo magazine back in January in France, Andrew, that was basically I know there was a key lock entrance to get into, or a card lock entrance to get into the building.
Yeah, but you're not dealing with Fort Knox.
No, and there was one unarmed security guard. That's a very soft target. This, on the other hand, was the antithesis of a soft target. This was a very hard target. I mean, even if they killed, and thank God nobody got killed in law enforcement guarding the entrances and exits, even if they had accomplished that, other law enforcement would descend upon them, and they would have to, like I said, traverse several football fields to get to the locked doors of the conference center. This was really, a hard mountain to climb, and even though it's a suicide mission, I have to wonder what they were thinking, because the odds of any kind of success were remote. And
it sounds like they were late to arrive anyway.
Yeah, it's whether they were, this is the thing, Andrew, even if they showed up early like I did, and I'm trying to get into the side of the head of a savage mass murderer, I would have looked at that landscape, and I would have said to myself, even though I'm, committed to carrying out this act and it's going to cost me my life, that because the chances of knocking off infidels is so remote here, maybe there's a better target down the line, or maybe there's another way we can do something to get on the front page of the newspaper. So they only managed to slightly wound a security guard, and I have to applaud the member of the Garland police force who, with a single service revolver, Andrew, took out these two guys.
Wow.
Which is, if you know anything about guns, is phenomenal marksmanship, given they had automatic weapons and body armor.
Yeah, and a little bit of inside baseball, just for listeners who might not know, you and I were actually in the same firearms safety course, so you and I have both learned about this.
Yeah. Good thing it wasn't me with that service revolver. I probably would have taken out a duck or something.
But here's the thing, though. We can make a bit light of this because at the end of the day, the only casualties were the ones who, in my eyes, and I don't make any bones about this, deserve to die, and they were the attempted terrorists. And you, David, a few moments ago alluded to the fact that this was not necessarily that well organized, or at least not as well as it could have been. However, at the same time, in the days since this, there's been an ISIS bounty put on Pamela Geller's head. There's also been claims by ISIS that they're taking credit for this shooting, and there's other evidence that I've seen whispers of that suggest maybe there was an active organizational role in this. So I guess the bigger question is, even if this one was poorly organized, it is not hyperbole to call this an act of terrorism. That's exactly what it was.
Oh, absolutely. And I would say this, Andrew, that if ISIS, and if this is indeed a point of fact, that they had some involvement and therefore they're taking credit for what happened, that's a good thing. Because, if you look at the ledger, one security officer slightly injured, he was treated and released the same day, versus two of those savages gunned down and dead. I'll take that any day versus, say, a 9/11 kind of catastrophe.
Absolutely. And it's unfortunate, though, we're in a place in history when we need to start making those distinctions and when we need to start picking which one we take over the other. That, to me, is the scary part here.
Well, I think what's also unsettling, Andrew, and it has to be said that it's almost the blame the victim mentality that has emerged in the wake of the shootings. This was about a pro-free speech, a pro-First Amendment event in light of censorship and bullies that want to curtail the First Amendment. And yet all I kept seeing was this being being reported, not in commentaries, but in straight news reporting, as an anti-Muslim event, an anti-Islam event, as opposed to a pro-free speech event. The second thing, Andrew, and this is very important, yes, we have free speech. Yes, we have the First Amendment, or at least you do in the United States. But did you have to be so provocative? That's the knee-jerk reaction. Well, let's go back to France in light of the Charlie Hebdo massacres. You remember a couple of days after that, another terrorist went into a kosher deli. And what he did is he killed 4 customers in that deli. Now, why? What was the reason for that? Were they drawing Mohammed cartoons? No. Were they Charlie Hebdo subscribers? No. Their act of provocation was they happened to be Jewish. So that begs the question. If being a Jew is provocative, what next? Is it wearing a bikini if you're a woman? Is it listening to certain types of music? Is it owning a dog? Is it eating a back bacon sandwich? When it comes to provocation, where do we draw the line? What next do we self-censor ourselves in terms of not offending people who have a absolute savage outlook on life?
Yeah, and also here, and I don't want to conflate two unrelated issues, David, but I think there is a parallel here that can be made, which is that the left is often the group that is telling us you can't at all say a woman was asking for it if she gets assaulted while she's walking down the street wearing revealing clothing. And they're absolutely right. But why is that same group here saying we can blame the victims of terrorism because they upset people?
This is the most fascinating narrative of all, Andrew. If you look at what the left stands for, and justifiably so, women's rights, gay rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the very things.
Well, I think on paper, maybe that's what they push for. I don't hear much advocacy for freedom of speech coming from the left usually.
No, but ostensibly, that's what they say they stand for. Yet these are the very things the Islamists despise and would not allow in an Islamic state under Sharia law. So this very unholy alliance that's going on right now is inexplicable. And my theory, Andrew, is that I think the worst thing you can call somebody on the left these days in the current narrative is an Islamophobe, right? And, I think what the left is practicing is the racism of lowered expectations. And by that I mean, when you look at a lot of Muslims, the brown-skinned people, and they wear different clothing than what we see in the West, and they speak different languages, and so the whole idea that this is a minority group, in certain countries, it's very unfashionable to criticize that kind of a group. So therefore, they will self-censor themselves just for fear of being called racist or bigoted or Islamophobic.
Yeah, and Pamela Geller herself has coined this the self-imposed Sharia.
It is. Andrew, going back to 2005, when the Danish cartoons were published and resulted in a massacre, 1.0 in terms of cartooning, the reaction of most of the world's media was appalling. Those cartoons, I love Mark Stein's observation on this, and I remember at the time what he said is that everybody from the New York Times to the local community supermarket flyer newspaper should have reprinted those cartoons, because the amount of money required to buy the TNT to blow up every media organization would have bankrupted the terrorists, right? And instead, what did we do? Oh, no, we can't publish this. But wait a minute. The news story is people died because of cartoons. Let's see the cartoon. Andrew, in the news pyramid, this is the first thing that should be...
Oh, and we went over this with the Charlie Hebdo cartoons as well. It was this absolutely laughable decision by mainstream media outlets to not show these cartoons, which were artifacts of history at this point, because they might hurt people's feelings.
Indeed. And, there's an element of unbelievable hypocrisy here, and that is, people in the mainstream media, reach out to moderate Muslims, and they say, you know what? You got to stand up to these thugs and terrorists and bad guys. You have to take a stance and say, not in my name. Now, if I'm one of those moderate Muslims and I see everyone from CNN, the New York Times, Time Magazine, right on down the list, too scared to reprint those cartoons, I'm thinking, wait a minute, with all your resources, you won't take these guys on? You want me to say something? Are you kidding me? So... please, like I said, Andrew, the hypocrisy is appalling.
Yeah, and we're just about out of time for the segment here, but one of the things as well that I find just so ridiculous about this is, you're right, at this free speech event, the winner, Bosch Foston, now being added to the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of hate groups because he won the contest.
Yeah, we are now in a society, I'm afraid, Andrew, where we are expected to show tolerance to those who are the most intolerable.
And the most intolerant themselves in many cases when you're dealing with radical Islamists.
Exactly. And please, I would ask that organization and all the other apologists is, what level of provocation justifies homicide? These are harmless cartoons. And I think at the end of the day, what I took away from this, Andrew, is that as you and I are speaking, those two terrorists are already worm meat, 6 feet under. And those cartoons, my friend, they live on forever. So I think in a small way, that's a victory.
Rebel contributor David the Menzoid Menzies joins me here on Lawton Online. David, really appreciate your time this afternoon, and glad you were able to make it out of Garland and back to the GTA safe and sound.
As am I, and you know what, Andrew? I think the only appropriate response is to have a second annual Jalal Muhammad cartoon. We can't kowtow to these savages. We can't subscribe to the philosophy of might makes right. We have to take a stance, and hopefully the show will go on.
Absolutely. I know this show will. More of Lawton Online comes up in just a couple of moments after the break here on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.media.
We're back on the program here to Lawton Online, but I wanted to continue along talking a bit more about what happened in Garland, Texas, because this is, despite the fact that it was a terrorist attack that netted only 2 casualties, the actual terrorists themselves, it still is a huge deal. And I think that a lot of people anyway, certainly people I've seen, have, like Menzoid and I were just talking about a few moments ago, gone towards blaming the victim, which is so laughable if it weren't so shameful, because of the fact that that seems to fly in the face of what the leftist ethos really is, which is one of protecting the victims, coddling the victims, embracing the victims. Why are they not lining up behind Pamela Geller and saying, oh my goodness, you did not deserve this, you did not have that coming? Because, as Menzoid said, and as has been reported in so much of the commentary around this on The Rebel and elsewhere, they just don't like those who express freedom of speech. And I don't want to sound overly dramatic. I mean, I sort of challenged Menzoid on this in the last segment. For all that the left talks about how it is the ideology that protects and preserves freedom, they really don't like free speech that much. They certainly don't like those people who embrace it, at least not if they're embracing and being empowered by their right to free speech and using it to go against what perhaps the mainstream media thinks, what perhaps the conventional leftist wisdom or what academia thinks. But they do this time and time again. They vilify those who are enacting something, anything, that goes against the grain. And I got to tell you, I don't agree with some of the things Pamela Geller says. I don't agree with some of the things a lot of people say. That doesn't mean I, for a second, deny their right to say those things. So why is it so acceptable for people to do that? Why is it so acceptable to take these people down? I've seen so many comments on Twitter in the last few days. I shouldn't say so many. I've seen more than is healthy, anyway, of people saying, essentially, good. Wish they did better. I saw one person on Facebook. We're not talking about someone tweeting out from an ISIS account here. We're talking about some white liberal secularist from Ontario saying she wishes that the people at the Draw Muhammad cartoon contest died. They deserve to die, she said. And I've screenshotted this and countless others that seem to have crossed that line where their freedom of speech is actually a threat of violence or an endorsement of violence. And I don't believe anyone should be censored. The problem is that our censorship now in 2015 is coming from ourselves in a lot of cases. How many people do you think would look at what happened to the AFDI event in Garland on Sunday and respond with fear? Oh my goodness, I'm not sure if I can do this. I'm not sure if I can speak out freely. I've got a family, I've got a job, I've got a life. Oh, I don't know if I can do this. Look at what I was talking about on the podcast last week. If you haven't listened, you should listen. They're all wonderful. The Charlie Hebdo Award received at the PEN American Center Gala by the editor-in-chief of Hebdo. But what I said then, I think, applies now as well, which is that people need to make a concerted effort to not submit to the fear, because that's what propagates this. It is fear. Censorship is not, at least not entirely, coming from government bureaucracy now. Sure, you see your human rights commissions and whatnot, but no, censorship is coming from ourselves. It's coming in the workplace. It's coming by the fear. And that's what these people want. That's what these terrorists, who are savages, there's no question about it, want. They want people to be terrorized, hence the name, into submission. And thank God for people like Pamela Geller for whom that does not work. People like Ezra Levant, people like Mark Stein, people like Geert Wilders, people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. But the fact is there is a small number of these people relative to how many people have been successfully censored. And look, I don't fault people who fear for their lives because of seeing examples of this, because they've seen shootings, they've seen bombings, they've seen what have happened to people, or what has happened, rather, when they dare to question terrorism, when they dare to call out radicalism. I don't blame anyone for seeing that and saying, well, maybe I don't want to go down that road. And this is why I think in general we need a collective dose of courage here. And to collectively stand up and say, we will not submit. We will not submit to the fear. We will not submit to the radicalism. We will not submit to the censorship, self-imposed or otherwise, that comes from these things in so many cases. It's not even about religion. No one who commits these acts of terror is doing it simply because they believe in a faith. No, it's about ideology. It's about advancing a religion and advancing an ideology, but it's political more than it's spiritual. I can assure you there's very little spiritual running into a building yelling Allahu Akbar while holding a gun. Trust me, I've prayed a lot in my life, and that's not how we do things. Yet there's one religious ideology where that is, I won't say commonplace, but certainly statistically you can see it exists in that and not elsewhere. And this is why when the left likes to conflate all of these different issues, for example, when they say, oh, but look at all the Christians that have killed in the past. Yes, many have. They point to the Crusades, and I say, yes, the Crusades are a great example of a holy war and how much carnage can come out of it. Crusades weren't examples of terrorism, though. It was a war. Justified or not justified, you're not talking about the same thing there as you are in the modern context when you see the unadulterated violence against innocents perpetrated by terrorists, by radicals, those motivated by their religious ideology, for whom the left is so able and willing to cast off as simply being mentally ill. How long until President Obama says Garland, Texas is nothing more than workplace violence? Don't laugh, it's coming. I'm waiting to hear how they backtrack out of that one. Remember when they blamed the Benghazi protest that killed American lives on a YouTube video in North America? Who knows who President Obama will throw under the bus this time? Probably Pamela Geller, who's already facing a fatwa from ISIS, which, having met her a few times, I can safely say was probably on her bucket list anyway, so I wouldn't fret too much for her. But who's shouldering the cost of security? It's her. She's got to. And I don't think she's putting up a stink about it. I've not spoken to her about it. But she's not submitting, nor should anyone else. More of Lawton Online coming up in just a few moments on TheRebel.media. Stay tuned. I'm Andrew Lawton.
He's irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
Welcome back to Lawton Online here on TheRebel.media. You know, it's very rare that I claim to be, nor even have the right to be, according to the official arbiters of human rights claims, the member of a victim group. It doesn't matter what victim group is, you see, because according to most people on the left, I am one of the privileged ones. According to people on the left, I'm a white, reasonably able-bodied male. I mean, I can't exactly run a marathon, but I don't think I ever could be able to anyway. But I'm heterosexual, I'm Christian, I was born in Canada, born to a middle-class family, I have a job. You see, I am as privileged as it comes. However, the story I'm about to share with you is enlightening in one way, because it actually gives me, for the first time in my life, the opportunity to be a member of a victim group. I get to feel what it feels like when you can blame someone else for your woes. And it's actually about a professor at the University of Windsor's very public push for obesity and obese Canadians to be put in a special class, a special place. Now, I'm one of these people, so I can say whatever I want. I am one of these people. He says that obese Canadians should be granted legal protection from discrimination. And it's concerning, because this sounds like something that's a parody, but it's not. I beg of you to stay with me on this. It's not just a disability, according to him. Because we've heard about this before. If you've ever watched The Simpsons, you'll know years ago there was that now infamous episode of The Simpsons where Homer Simpson wanted to go on disability. He went to Dr. Nick, was told he had to gain, I think it was enough weight that he was 300 pounds, and then all of a sudden he'd be able to go on disability, wouldn't have to work, everything would be fine. Well, this has long since been accepted. As a matter of fact, Europe's going through something pertaining to this as it stands now. A European court ruled that you cannot discriminate against overweight people as far as employment is concerned, because obesity is a disability, etc. Well, what this professor is pushing for is even further along than that, and unfortunately, I think not that far away from implementation. Bill Bogart, a law professor, was speaking at the 4th Annual Canadian Obesity Summit in Toronto. Believe this is a real thing, an obesity summit. Don't know if they hold it at Krispy Kreme or not, but regardless, they managed to get everyone to Toronto for this, what I can only assume was a large affair. And he was speaking and he said, quote, "We need a fundamental shift in our norms and in our regulation addressing obesity." He said it's not simply a matter of laziness or complacency or something that people could fix if they try harder. He said it's an issue of human rights. And I recognize, by the way, that obesity is in many cases a disability. However, I think it's more often than not a byproduct of a disability than it is itself a disability. For example, if you have an illness that prevents you from exercising, you may be obese. If you have a thyroid condition in which you're not able to metabolize food as well as those unfortunate skinny people who can eat a Big Mac like there's no tomorrow and experience no weight gain whatsoever can, then that's a disability. But just being fat is, and I say this as someone, if you haven't seen me, look me up, I am fat. It is, to many people, laziness. To many people, it's a lack of willpower. To some, yeah, there is something medical that prevents them from being able to lose weight. But believe me when I say that is the minority, not the majority. They are the exception, not the rule. And it's unfortunate for a lot of people who are big. And I say this honestly to you for a moment, because it's not easy to fix it. It's not something that I can just go home, flip a switch, and boom, all of a sudden I'm going to be thin. But it is simple. And that's the best way I can describe it. It's not easy, but it is simple. The formula is a very basic one to understand, which is exercise more, eat less. The fact is, even though I exercise and even though I try to bring my eating into control, this has only been something I've relatively recently looked at. And for other people, this desire to not be fat, if it even exists, is underwhelming compared to the desire they have to eat what they want, to not exercise, etc. And you know what? These are choices that people get to make. I don't believe in a fat tax. I don't believe we should penalize people for wanting to eat whatever they want. If you have a problem with the fact that obese people are a burden on the healthcare system, well, great, let's take advantage of this opportunity to change the healthcare system. Not go after people that have an indulgence that is food. Some people have alcohol, some people have cigarettes, some people have gambling, other people have Big Macs and jelly beans. In my case, sometimes just for breakfast. But here's the thing. What Professor Bogart is advocating for is not just looking at obesity as a disability. He's saying we need to look at it as a lifestyle. He's trying to rail against what he calls appearance bias. Because if you have a disability and you're overweight as a symptom of that, and you get turned down a job, you can claim, oh, you're discriminating against me, it's my disability, and therefore you hate disabled people. This is essentially how the victim culture works. There's no subtle discrimination. It's, oh, therefore you hate cripples. Therefore you hate, black people. Therefore you hate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. By calling it appearance bias, they're saying that it's simply just a self-expression matter. Like you have gender expression, now you have weight expression. I express my self-love through my body, through my weight. I express, my love of cheeseburgers that way as well. But here's where I think it takes a huge divergence from reality. Because as much as, the Dove beauty campaigns and the Lady Gagas might want to run out and say, love yourself, be yourself, embrace your inner beauty, let yourself roar, as Gaga once sang, because baby, you were born this way. I think that was about homosexuality, but let's use it for obesity here for a second. Even if all of these people run out and say, just accept who you are, they're missing the mark that obesity is unhealthy. This is not a surprise. This is not a shock. This is not something that anyone should find particularly offensive. This is just a statement of fact. Obesity kills. And I say this as someone who at my heaviest was over 300 pounds. Now I'm substantially less than that. But I've had to work hard to get there. I also had a stroke 6 years ago, and I'm not an old guy. So I recognize that this has consequences. I still think it's a personal choice, don't get me wrong. But let's not delude ourselves into thinking that, fat acceptance is something for which we should be striving to accomplish as a society, because it's not. It's not something that we should be looking after. We should be trying to build a healthier society, but you do that through education. You do that through essentially getting people to want to. And I don't think you manipulate that by making it more expensive to eat unhealthily. I don't think you manipulate that by saying, all right, well, you're not able to get health care coverage. I think you do it by, what I would say anyway, is simply a matter of working through the education system. Maybe you give like a broccoli tax credit or something. Every time you buy a head of broccoli at the grocery store, you get like 50 cents off your income taxes. I don't know. But I'm much more in favor of giving people tax credits for good decisions rather than penalizing people by taxing them on what we as society deem quote-unquote poor decisions. But when I look at Bogart's comments here, the law professor who spoke at the obesity summit, it's a bit laughable. He's saying we need to move away from a stigmatization of fat people towards an acceptance of people. These are his words, quote, in a variety of shapes and sizes, unquote. First off, I think we're dealing with sizes more than shapes. It's not like you see someone walking around shaped like a trapezoid and you say, oh my goodness, that person's shaped like a trapezoid. No, we're dealing with, round, pear-shaped, or a stick. Like these are the fundamental geometry or geometric shapes of people here based on their actual weight. But he says many fat people don't regard themselves as disabled or ill. They want to be judged on merits, not measurements. Great. If you're applying for a job where your weight doesn't matter, I'm not sure people are discriminating against you based on your weight. I'm plenty fat. I have been my whole life. I've never been discriminated against, except for, of course, by the odd, woman who shot me down when I've asked her out. But even then, if I could sue them for fat discrimination, I wish I knew that, 10 years ago, not now. Maybe if you're applying to be a Hooters waitress, but you know what? I think then that's an area where I would venture a guess to say every customer would be okay with discriminating against you based on your weight. Now, it's worth noting here, if we're looking at the fascinating area of employment discrimination, I'm one of these people that believes the threshold should be basically non-existent. I don't think we should have these faux human rights. I don't think anyone has the right to be free from someone else's judgment, regardless of what the root of that judgment is. If it's because they don't like your race, fine. They don't like your sexual orientation, fine. They don't like your weight, fine. Why would you want to work at a place where you are not respected for your abilities as an employee anyway? That's the question I would ask. But it's this ongoing pattern we see that keeps adding isms and phobias. This pattern of creating victims, creating victim groups. I mean, it used to be where the real persecution, and just look at civil rights era United States, by the way. If you were a black person in the U.S., you were actually denied rights. You were denied rights by the state. You were denied rights by your fellow man. regardless of the process and the length of time it took for civil rights to come into effect, black people had very legitimate grievances. Now we fast forward, 50 years later, and they're literally making shit up now. And we've seen this with the human rights commissions in Canada, in the provincial human rights tribunals as well. The groups that apparently are supposed to be free from discrimination seem to outweigh the number of groups that actually exist in the world, which is laughable. There was the case in British Columbia a few years ago. The BC Human Rights Tribunal, a McDonald's employee, somehow had the human right to not have to wash her hands even though she was serving food. You have the guy in Ontario who was told that he had the human right to smoke pot at someone else's restaurant in the doorway. And it goes on and on and on. And I'm not even talking about your conventional grievance groups here, your feminists, your gays, your Muslims, the three that seem to have the monopoly on workplace discrimination complaints. We're talking about a list that keeps mounting. I must say, I would hate to be a corporate HR executive in 2015 when you have to look at the whole list that seems to be updating by the week of all the people against whom you're not allowed to have judgment. You're seeing things on there, you're like, I don't even know what these things are. I don't even know what these people are. Okay, we can't discriminate against someone because they're a minority. Okay, no, Aboriginal, yep, okay. Gender, yep, we got disability, yep, okay. Obesity, yep, hair color, oh man, piercings, yeah, like you get down to the point where this is why affirmative action exists. Because it forces people to be so afraid of being seen as blankophobic or blankist, whatever the blank is of the day, the victim group du jour, that they feel they need to pad the numbers in other ways. And I think it was in last week's podcast, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about a story I broke a couple of years ago at U of T where they were actually hiring based on so-called sexual minorities. They were hiring based on people that could self-identify as being a member of a marginalized sexual orientation. Now, if I were applying for a job at U of T, I would have said, great, they have no idea what I do in the bedroom, so I can just check off, that I'm a trisexual. I'll try anything. And they can't judge me for that. But I wonder if this is going to extend to affirmative action hires for obese Canadians if we go further down the pendulum, or if obesity is a disability, can anyone who is fat simply check off the box that says, do you wish to self-identify as a person with a disability? Because, I'm sure they're not allowed to ask you what the disability is. If anyone really pushes you, say, well, I'm obese. That's my disability. And you can't do anything about it because that's the group that we're creating. Give this 5 years, and I think anyone with a cold is going to be considered a person with a disability as far as being free from discrimination goes, because after all, we need to protect everyone. Lest the unthinkable happen, lest the unconscionable happen, lest the reprehensible reality happens that someone has their feelings hurt. That seems to be the most important ill in society against which the grievance group creators seem to be trying to protect people. And I'm looking at a piece in the National Post about Professor Bogart's advocacy, if you can call it that. And he's saying that human rights legislation should be amended, add the term obesity as a new category of freedom, or amend the laws to ban appearance bias. Now, appearance bias is even more dangerous. Because once you put appearance bias in, you're basically taking every dimension that someone could have and making it a reason that someone is apparently granted additional human rights. You've got hair color, eye color, glasses, skin tone, complexion, acne, body hair, body piercings. You've got everything on there. And it's getting to the point where no ugly person is going to be able to be passed over for a job without suing, because they'll have lowered the bar so much. It's great for me, don't get me wrong. Selfishly, this is going to benefit me probably more than it's going to benefit, the pretty blonde girl or the handsome, dark, tall guy. Tall, dark, and handsome. That's what it is. Sorry, I'm getting all discombobulated thinking about all these tall, handsome men in my mind right now. It's like my visions of sugar plum fairies dancing around and so on and so forth. But the reality is, why are we giving anyone protection from discrimination? Why don't we, here's an idea, rely on the goodness of people? I know, such a laughable concept, but bear with me here. Rely on the fact that maybe people can self-regulate in this respect. After all, we've seen how quick the social media mob is, perhaps too quick, to jump on and defend people and conversely attack people as well, why can we not expect that, hey, maybe we don't need a human rights commission tasked with determining if someone has been discriminated against when we can allow the market to decide? And this is something that ties in very well with what's been raging down in Indiana. When despite the fact that you've had in the last year riots in places like Ferguson and Baltimore, you have people that are so up in arms about whether or not someone should be forced to bake a cake for someone else. That's been, I think, the most potent and apt example of that. Whether or not a Christian baker should be forced to bake a cake for a gay wedding. And everyone's been, first off, making this issue out to be so much larger than it has to be, but no one's really asked the obvious question, which is it really that hard for anyone to find someone else to bake them a cake? Is this really how far we're prepared to drive down what a human right really is? And every time a story like this one that I've been discussing this segment comes out about some other group needing to be free from discrimination, it further dilutes what a real human right is. The right to free speech, like we were talking about earlier with the Garland, Texas event. The right to vote, as people in PEI and Alberta have experienced this week. The right to move around. The right to be yourself. The right to decide how you want to define yourself rather than allowing some bureaucrat or professor or government official in some other capacity to define who you are based on your dimensions. It's funny, the left claims to hate racism, sexism, ableism, appearanceism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. The left claims to hate these things, yet who is it that is constantly trying to define people by their race, their religion, their sexuality, their gender identity, etc.? It is the left. The right, I think, would be just as content to pretend it does not exist and to actually take advantage of the groundwork that Martin Luther King laid out. You know, that nifty line about the content of one's character. Not their BMI, for crying out loud. That's not what the Million Man March was all about. We got to take a break here. Lawton Online resumes in just a couple of moments. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
We are back on Lawton Online, and I actually want to take advantage of this opportunity here because this week, more than any other week in the year, at least until summer break for the student starts in another month or so, this week I may have the opportunity to reach some young minds here, especially in Ontario. If you're outside of Ontario, bear with me, you'll want to hear this, because everywhere in the province, from Windsor to Thunder Bay to Ottawa, everywhere in the province there is a discussion going on about the sex ed curriculum. People in Ontario, parents specifically, not that happy about the curriculum that the Ontario government here, led by Kathleen Wynne, has put in place for the fall. And there are a couple of things to note here, and whether you're from Ontario or not, stay tuned to this, because I want to make sure that I'm absolutely clear on the facts here. First off, let me clarify by saying I'm not as outraged by this curriculum as some people are. I'm not for it, but I'm also not against it with the level of vitriol and passion that so many seem to be. My issue, more than the content, more than the actual curriculum itself, has been with the process this whole time. It has. I dislike that a curriculum that was yanked 5 years ago has somehow been brought back up with very little amendment to it, as though it's somehow unique and different. I dislike that clearly tens of thousands of parents across the province, as has been demonstrated by the protests being staged by so many parents this week, they're against this. And yeah, you're never going to please anyone, especially not with something as contentious as a sex ed curriculum. But when you have this many people that are prepared to stake their children's education on the line. Not their children's execution. Then we're getting to a different country's sex ed curriculum altogether. But when you have so many parents that are prepared to stake their children's education and schooling on the line for this, that means that maybe parents feel like they've been left out in the dust. So what's been happening, you ask? Well, what a great question. I'm glad you asked. Because parents have been, this week, pulling their children out of class to protest the sex ed curriculum that's going into effect in September. And this is in addition to rallies that happened a couple of weeks ago. The curriculum was only released about a month ago. It was shrouded in secrecy up until that point. It was known it was coming. It was known it was going to be loosely modeled on the 2010 curriculum. Now, I also want to make sure to point out here, the 2010 curriculum was consulted upon by a man by the name of Ben Levin. He wasn't the sole author of it. He wasn't the only one involved, but he was, as the Deputy Minister of Education, certainly involved in the process, a consultant to Education Minister Liz Sandals, and also someone who at the past had the ear of Kathleen Wynne. Levin, also a few weeks ago, convicted of child pornography, pleaded guilty to possession of child pornography. The agreed upon statement of facts in that case, I can't even bring myself to read it out loud. Many of the details were so concerning. And I don't say that because I want to unfairly tarnish the sex ed curriculum. I say that because I want there to be some context here. Is he the only one involved in the curriculum? No. But was he involved? Yes. This is the same curriculum. And when you have a connection like that, it brings up a couple of points here. Number one, there's always going to be that doubt. Was this influenced by him beyond what it would have been otherwise? But here's the bigger question. And this is one that I think plays more into the process than it does into Levin's perversions, which is if his behavior and his role in this and involvement in this was overlooked, what else has been overlooked? And I'm not talking about other, child pornographers. Look, we're talking about Ben Levin, I believe, wholeheartedly an isolated case. That's not what I'm trying to go down the road of here. But we're looking at a guy that I think was in a position of authority. And he was. His title was Deputy Minister of Education. That is a pretty big deal. And now we're looking at a curriculum on which parents across the province, legislators in the province especially, Monty McNaughton himself, the MPP from Lambton Kent Middlesex, has been very front and center on this issue, feel they have been left out in the dark on it. And if you look at the numbers, by the way, of how many parents pulled their kids out of school this week, at least on Monday, numbers haven't been confirmed for the whole province, but in Toronto alone, there were 35,000 students that were not at class. There was one school, Thorncliffe Public School in Toronto, where the school had only a 10% rate of students showing up. Because the parents were saying, look, we are not having any of this. A kindergarten class as well at another school in Toronto had 90 of 600 and some odd students show up. 12 to 14% or so it ended up being totally. So whether right or wrong, there is a problem here. The Liberal government cannot put this genie back in the bottle. And this is, I think, the biggest question that needs to be answered here. Look, I looked at the curriculum, and admittedly, when it came out, I wanted to hate it a lot more than I ended up hating it. Now, a lot of it was par for the course to how sex ed is already. A lot of stuff had been moved around. For example, units on masturbation had been moved up from grade 5 to grade 4. They had added things like sexting and cyberbullying and those things, which I think is actually fairly valid. Certainly something on which I think parents should be the primary educators, but still good to have in the curriculum because this is a very real threat, and especially for young boys and girls, but specifically boys who could theoretically end up on a sex offenders list for life if they receive naked pictures from one of their friends or girlfriends or boyfriends or partners, whatever the case may be. And this is something that I think should result in every student, male and female, being educated on the risks and the implications. But herein lies, I think, one of the more concerning realities here, is that we get into the social issues in this curriculum at a very young age. Gender, taught in grade 1 and grade 2. Gender expression, around the same time. Gender identity, as well, taught in that same window. When you get to grade 7 and 8, you're looking at things like oral sex, anal sex, STIs, contraceptives, and other forms of pregnancy prevention, etc. But we're looking at 6-year-olds in grade 1 that are being taught about consent. Now, yes means yes, no means no, except we know it's not that simple. We know from looking at university campus advocacy that sometimes yes doesn't even mean yes. So when we're looking at something that even adults can't seem to agree on a definition for, how can we expect that a 6-year-old can be given an honest and all-encompassing view of what consent is, something that is so nuanced, so detailed, and so intricate, and something that appears to be changing by the week? And then when we look at gender identity, same-sex relationships, etc., I don't think every child is going to be ready for these conversations at the same time. I think teaching kids that same-sex relationships exist is something that a parent could quite easily accomplish. You're walking down the street with little Tommy. Little Tommy sees a man holding a man's hand, says, "What's that?" "Well, Tommy, that's a homosexual relationship." Same as gender expression. Little Tommy asks, "Hey, why is that man wearing a dress?" "Well, little Tommy." And so on and so forth. And look, I realize every parent is going to be different at that. Some parents are going to be more adept at these conversations than others. But even though the government has allowed this curriculum to be to be optional, rather, so parents can say, "Hey, I'm pulling my child out," the existence of it and the process behind it and the lack of due process behind it has taken a lot of the steam out of parents' abilities to be parents. And this, to me, is the source of outrage here. Not the content, but how the content came to be. You know, the Ontario government has touted the long-standing discussions that she's been having, yet I've talked to so many people on my radio show months ago. I put this to the phones and said, "Hey, are any parents in London people who have been consulted on this?" And people said, "Well, you know, we were invited to make comments to our principal, and then he would pass it along to the board, and the board would pass it along." And that was literally the most concise answer I got. No one was invited to any of these round tables that apparently took place. So I have to wonder if these were only for the select few, the chosen few, whose opinions mattered on something like this. Yeah, probably liberal membership database, who knows? And we're going to see, I think, a long road between now and September. I just think it's hilarious. You know, we have teachers in Ontario next week potentially going on strike, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. You have students staging walkouts. You have parents striking, essentially, with their kids. You managed to have created, Kathleen Wynne, a situation that I think is unprecedented, at which teachers, students, and parents are all at the same time protesting different things. I give her credit for that. She certainly has created something magical with her majority government. We got to take a break here. Lawton Online resumes momentarily. Stay with us.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
Well, you heard the man. It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, where we scour every corner of the globe from Vancouver to Papua New Guinea to the Philippines to Mississauga, and we find the story so outrageous there must be a liberal involved. And today we go no further than the good old state of Florida, where a homeless man was arrested and charged for attempting to cash a check for $368 billion. Yes, billion with a B. so many zeros that they didn't even fit on the line. He had to wrap it around and then go down the side of the check to get all the zeros in. But yes, Jeff Waters went into a Bank of America on Monday morning in Jacksonville, Florida, attempted to cash the check. It was made out to cash and reportedly from the U.S. Bank of Idaho. It was signed and dated in the 90s. He explained that someone sold it to him for $100. And he was told it would clear for any amount that he wanted to write it for. He said he wanted the $368 billion to start an Italian restaurant. He told the police, according to their statements, quote, "It's always been my dream to own the best Italian restaurant in the earth. I'm 10% Italian. Cooking authentic Italian food is in my blood. I plan to make the restaurant 80 million square feet and be able to accommodate 30 million eaters at once. Plus, it was going to be totally underwater, so people could look at sharks while they ate. But the bank wouldn't give me the money they owed me. I was told the check was good for any amount I wanted to write it for. Blame Tito, not me. I'm as innocent as a schoolgirl," unquote. Only in Florida is this the transcript of a police interview. In any case, he's been charged for 1 count of forgery. But that's not all. He's also been charged with possessing bath salts, and I don't think they're talking about the therapeutic things for the bathtub, and unlawfully carrying Chinese throwing stars. I didn't actually know, to be honest, there was a lawful way to carry Chinese throwing stars, but apparently he was not doing that. He was released. He posted $23,000 bail. No word how he paid for that. If he had to, maybe write another check in general, I would be a bit concerned if I were the police, but it's safe to say that when you think you can just walk in off the street and claim $368 billion in cash that is not yours, it's safe to say that Jeff Waters must be a liberal. There's no other way. I want to thank David the Menzoid Menzies for coming on the program today, as well as all who listened to today's episode of Lawton Online. I'll be back next week, folks, on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.